quê?
Olá! TUTAMÉIA está ao vivo nesse segundo ano da pandemia no Brasil, criminosamente amplificada pela ação do governo Jair Bolsonaro. Estamos nós aqui nos nossos estúdios quarentênicos, a Eleonora,
o Rodolfo,
e do lado de lá da tela conversa conosco hoje o nosso querido Noam Chomsky, o mais importante intelectual do planeta hoje. Você já o conhece, claro, a Eleonora já vai falar um pouquinho mais sobre ele antes de fazer a primeira pergunta, mas antes a gente queria convidar o Chomsky, a Eleonora e todos vocês que já se integram aqui a essa entrevista, para que a gente mande aqui um abraço de solidariedade, forme uma rede de carinho para todos os parentes, amigos, conhecidos, colegas de trabalho das vítimas da Covid-19 no Brasil. É um número sempre crescente, enorme no mundo hoje, e que todos nós sabemos poderia ser muito menor se o presidente da República tivesse seguido as orientações da Organização Mundial de Saúde, das instituições médicas e científicas brasileiras. Não o fez. E hoje, agora há pouco, às 18 horas, o Conselho Nacional de Secretários de Saúde divulgou os mais recentes números da pandemia no Brasil. Já são 313.866 mortes, 12.573.615 casos. Na última semana, como já nos últimos dias, mas na última semana, o Brasil foi o país do mundo que teve o maior número de mortes. O número de mortes no Brasil foi maior do que o número de mortes somada dos 4 seguintes: Estados Unidos, México, Itália e Rússia somados. Essa é a situação que nos colocou Jair Bolsonaro. E sobre isso, esse é um dos temas que vamos conversar agora com Noam Chomsky. Eleonora.
Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure, so great to have you here. As Rodolfo just said, Brazil leads dramatically the death by COVID in the world. Bolsonaro is responsible for a large part of this death. Many claim that a genocide is underway in Brazil. Do you agree with this view? What's your analysis of what happens in Brazil today?
Well, Brazil is at the moment, the world's leading disaster. The United States actually has more deaths. It's the highest in the number of deaths, but things are being done in the United States. Now that the Trump administration is out, the new administration is in fact carrying through vaccination programs at a reasonable level. The big problem in the United States is that the Republican Party is it's kind of like Bolsonaro. It's Bolsonaro's model. They're not cooperating. In my own state, for example, Arizona, where Valeria and I live, the health department is calling for significant measures, and the governor, and it's one of the highest rates in the country, in fact, in the world. The governor, who's Republican, a Trump Republican, has just eliminated the mandates for masks and called for opening the bars. Well, when you have that kind of conflict going on in the country, many people don't want to do anything. Among Republicans, about almost half say they may not or will not take the vaccine because they're getting one kind of message from their party leaders. There's another message coming from the scientific community. You'll recognize that. The same thing happening in Brazil, but more extreme. I mean, the lack of vaccines in Brazil is just an international scandal. I mean, especially when we think of Brazil, it's a country that was known for its wonderful biological institutions, its enormous success in vaccination in the past. It was a world leader. Now it's right at the bottom, and we know where we can assign the responsibility for that. If we look at what the United States, what the Trump administration is doing, it's pretty shocking in the case of Brazil too. So the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States, the leading federal department which deals with health, it just came out a couple of weeks ago with its annual report for 2020, and hidden in the report is a description of what the health department was doing in Latin America. So it says in Brazil, it pressured the U.S. embassy in Brazil was pressuring the Brazilian government to reject Russian vaccines, even though Western authorities regard them as the same as the Western vaccines. And the reason was to prevent the malign influence of Russia in the hemisphere. They also pressured the government of Panama, which is also suffering severely, pressured them to stop using Cuban volunteers to help in the countryside, just what happened in Brazil shortly before, because of Cuba's malign influence and so on. They're acting to try to maximize the deaths and suffering to ensure domination of the hemisphere. It's nothing new, but it's in a particularly savage form today. Trump's the leading official in the health advisor in the Trump administration, Dorothy Birx, who recently resigned, has spoken recently about the fact that she put it that we could have saved 300 or 400 deaths if we had acted properly in the early stages. But the government failures, one day it's flu, the other day I'm the first person who discovered it, the next day something else, just left people hanging in the wind. And Brazil, where Bolsonaro follows Trump very closely, that's his idol, is just a caricature. It's kind of like what Marx said about tragedy turning into farce. Tragedy in the United States, farce in Brazil. So yes, it's a horrible situation, and whether anything will happen, who knows? I mean, you know better than I do, but it seems right now that there's a kind of a purge of the cabinet, of the administration going on in Brazil. People being fired, people resigning. It's hard to know what that means, what Bolsonaro has up his sleeve. Yeah, but that's what things look like now. There are signs in the United States, there are signs of improvement, but there is the problem of the Republican Party, which is making things more difficult, sending out false messages, confusing its own voter base, many of whom just are refusing to take vaccines, which will be a disaster. You can't deal with it if, 40% of the population says, I'm not going to take a vaccine, I'm not going to put on a mask.
Yeah, like you just, the sentence you just said a few minutes ago, it was a phrase that you said when you interviewed you in April last year. Trump is a tragedy, Bolsonaro a farce. Now Trump is gone. Is Bolsonaro a tragedy, not only for Brazil, but for the world? And actually, some countries say that Brazil, that the pandemic in Brazil may be a menace for the world because of the lead that Bolsonaro gave to the country.
I wish I could agree with you that Trump is gone. He isn't. Trump basically owns the voting base of the Republican Party. The owners of the party, the rich, the powerful, the donor class, they never particularly liked Trump, but they were willing to tolerate him because he was lining their pockets with money. His entire legislative program totally was just enriching the rich beyond their wildest dreams and harming everyone else. So they were willing to tolerate him. It's interesting that that ended on January 6th. January 6th was just too much. So the people who basically own the country and own the party, with interesting unanimity, immediately told Trump to get lost. They issued an order saying it's over. And then something quite interesting happened. The Senate, which relies, of course, on heavily on campaign donations, started running for the exits. But they didn't go too far, because when they got to the exits, they ran into Trump's raging crowds. So they're stuck. The bosses are telling them to get rid of Trump, but if they do, they'll lose the next election because he's got the voter base in his pocket. The most interesting person to look at is Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, one of maybe the most powerful person in the country. He's the money maker for the Republicans. He's the main source of income for funding. On the other hand, Trump has the voters, so he doesn't know which way to go. It's party is split. So, and what they're planning is pretty explicit. They just want to make the country ungovernable make sure that no legislation passes. You could see it in the stimulus bill that just passed. Most of the Republican Congress favor the provisions in it, and they know their constituents favor the provisions, but 100% voted against. Those are the party orders. It's kind of like the old Communist Party. You get orders from above, you follow them 100%, no questions asked. And that's what's going to happen. Every proposal that the Democrat administration makes to try to deal with the crises, the Republicans will do everything possible to block it, hoping that the country will be ungovernable, that it won't be possible to deal with the crises. They can blame the Democrats. Come back in 2022, same year as Brazil's election, congressional elections in 2022, they might come back and take Congress. Then the next 2 years, you get Trump coming back. He's not going.
You just mentioned the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. In Brazil, the far-right groups are in federal government, of course, and in the police, the regional police, state police, and they are threatening with riots. How do you see the strength of the extreme right today in the US and in Brazil? The defeat of Trump affects those movements around the world, the far-right movements?
Well, the Trump administration is often criticized as not having a geopolitical strategy, but that's not exactly correct. They had a very definite geopolitical strategy. Whether Trump understood it or not, I have no idea. But he's mostly thinking about himself. But whoever was doing the thinking, there was a clear strategy. The strategy was to organize a reactionary international of the most reactionary, harsh states in the world, run by the White House as a base for American power. And you can see it very clearly. In the Western Hemisphere, Bolsonaro was the main base. Biggest country, most important country, guaranteed to follow Trump loyally, whatever he did. So that's the Western Hemisphere. A couple of other pretty ugly characters, Colombia, others brought along. In the Middle East, the most reactionary, brutal states in the world are brought together in the under the Trump umbrella, under Washington's umbrella. That's the family dictatorships of the Gulf, which are important because of their resources and strategic position. Egypt is under the worst, most brutal dictator of its history, al-Sisi. Trump calls him my favorite dictator. They're part of it, of course. The recent, what are called the Abraham Accords, are quite interesting. They were praised in the West, bringing together Israel and the reactionary Gulf states. That's part of it. Israel has moved so far to the right that it's almost invisible. I mean, the elections are between two far right parties, one of them farther right than the other. And Israel's alliance with the reactionary Gulf states, I mean, it's actually been happening for a long time, but now it's formalized. Palestinians, of course, are kicked in the face that they have no power, so they don't matter. Anyone with no power just gets thrown out. Moving to the east, the main member of the alliance is Modi's India. Modi is dismantling Indian secular democracy, turning it into a kind of a neo-fascist Hindu ethnocracy, brutal invasion of Kashmir, one of the worst occupations maybe the worst occupation in the world. India itself being democracy torn to shreds, racist attacks on Muslims, press being muzzled. So he's a very natural member of the alliance. In Europe, it's Viktor Orban's Hungary, destroying Hungarian democracy, creating what's sometimes called an illiberal democracy, which means not a democracy. In Italy, people like Mario Salvini, the right wing, the far right in Italy, and other similar people around the world. That's a strategy. It's a geopolitical strategy. It'd be interesting to see what Biden does with it. So far, no change. Biden's domestic policies have been better than I anticipated, frankly. Pretty good. But foreign policy is a disaster. Picking up everything Trump did, even the most dangerous and threatening, sometimes making them worse. Like heading up confrontational policies with Russia and China. That's just crazy. I mean, it makes no sense. The major crises that the world faces are international. They always were, but now it's transparent. They have no borders. There's no borders to the pandemic. There's no borders to heating up the atmosphere. There's no borders to the spread of nuclear weapons. There's no borders to the deterioration of democracy around the world. These are contagious things. They have to be dealt with cooperatively. Well, the Chinese are, in fact, offering to move cooperatively, but they're just being kicked in the face by, first by Trump, much more even by Biden. The recent Anchorage meetings are an example. That's extremely, in fact, the current nuclear is a strategic posture. The conception of what the military posture ought to be, it's just a new one in 2018. It actually calls for being powerful enough to win simultaneous wars against China and Russia. And that's so lunatic. There are no words for it. I mean, anyone who has the slightest understanding of nuclear and foreign affairs knows that if any country attacks a state with nuclear weapons, we're all finished, including the attacking country. It's just lunacy, but it's moving in that direction. And in fact, Biden's just announced a big increase in military forces and bases in what's called the Indo-Pacific region, meaning off the coast of China. The United States already has a couple hundred bases there with missiles, nuclear missiles aimed at China and so on. To step that up at a time when you have to be moving towards diplomacy and negotiations is suicidal. But a lot of the policies that are being pursued now are suicidal. Even countries that we are used to thinking of as moderately civilized, the European Union, for example. It's amazing to watch the European Union take vaccines. Every rich country is trying to monopolize vaccines. Many of them, including Canada, including the United States now, have far more vaccines than they can possibly use. They're just stored. They all understand, the leadership understands very well that if the vaccines are not distributed to the poor countries of the world, Africa, Asia, much of Latin America, what's going to happen is the virus will mutate, as is happening already, and more lethal variants will come along, and it'll end up destroying all of us. But they know that, but they're refusing to do anything about it. In fact, the really rich countries, United States, Switzerland, others with big pharmaceutical industries, are preventing what's called a people's vaccine, and a global effort to try to distribute vaccines very widely, both for ethical reasons and even for reasons of survival. The countries with big pharmaceutical industries are refusing because it'll cut into the profit of their industries. So they'd rather make sure their own industries, which are overflowing with money, they're super rich, must become even richer, even if it means we all commit suicide. What's happening is, if you take a look at some of the small things that are happening are in some ways more revealing than the major atrocities, like what I mentioned about the US Embassy trying to prevent Brazil from getting vaccines, or preventing Panama from using Cuban doctors, which they desperately need. In fact, continuing on the pressures on Cuba, even when it's in the lead in global internationalism. In fact, you could see that at the beginning of the pandemic. Go back early 2020. In Europe, the first major pandemic was in northern Italy. Okay, northern Italy is part of what's called the European Union. Happens that right north of Italy, there are two very rich countries, Austria and Germany. They had succeeded at that time in getting the pandemic pretty much in control. Did they send any help to northern Italy, a couple of kilometers to the south in the European Union? Oh, fortunately, Italy was able to appeal to the superpower across the Atlantic, Cuba, which sent lots of doctors and medical equipment to help out in northern Italy. In fact, Cuban internationalism is astonishing. Doesn't matter what you think. Think what you like about Cuba. Okay, could go into that. Whatever you think about it, the internationalism is genuine and spectacular. And they're punished for it. That's why one of the reasons the U.S. keeps extremely harsh, brutal sanctions, a virtual embargo on Cuba. The idea is you have to try to punish the population as much as possible. You have to impede development. The U.S. sanctions, of course, are third-party sanctions. Everybody has to obey them, whether you like it or not. So Europe doesn't like U.S. sanctions, but they have to obey them. If you don't, you get thrown out of the international financial system. So they obey. And sometimes the power plays are pretty spectacular. A couple of weeks ago, I'm sure you noticed, UN sanctions on Iran terminated. The U.S. wanted them renewed. They went to the Security Council, total opposition. Every U.S. ally, virtually everyone else opposed it. Well, that wasn't a big problem. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, went back to the Security Council and told them, I'm sorry, folks, but you're reinstituting the sanctions. Okay? Can't do anything about it. The U.S. is too powerful. Although we should, it's kind of not described this way and it's impolite. But the fact of the matter is the world runs very much like the mafia. The Godfather gives orders. If you don't follow them, you're in trouble. If you can be small or large, whoever you are, you follow the Godfather's orders. And furthermore, this is official policy. One of the good things about the United States is it's a very free society by comparative standards. So we have unusual, unparalleled access to internal planning documents. They're secret at the time, but it's possible to get hold of them. Freedom of Information Act, other measures. So we have the documents from the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the early 60s, on what the policy towards Cuba was. And it's explicit. They say the problem of Castro's Cuba is his successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s. The U.S. announced in the 1820s that it was going to dominate the hemisphere and everybody else has to keep out. Wasn't powerful enough at the time to implement it. The British were the most powerful state and they were blocking it. But it was clear to the planners, we know from the record, that they recognized that over the years, Britain would become weaker, the United States would become more powerful, the United States could take over the hemisphere and run it, which is what happened. And Cuba is carrying out successful defiance of these policies, just as Allende was in Chile, just as Goulart was in Brazil. You don't tolerate that. If you're the mafia don, you smash any successful defiance. That's why, from almost the first moment of its independence in 1959, the U.S. started attacking Cuba. Can't have this independence. It's much too dangerous. First of all, if one country becomes successful in independence, others are going to follow. It's what Henry Kissinger called a virus that spreads contagion. He was afraid it would spread contagion all the way to southern Italy. Not that the Chilean army was going to conquer Rome, but that the model of parliamentary social democracy might influence developments in Spain and Italy. We can't allow that. So you got to crush it with violence and brutality, which is what was done, case after case. First one was Brazil, 64, which you're supposed to commemorate tomorrow, I think, something like that. But, and then right through the hemisphere, up to Central America in the 1980s. and through the rest of the world too. Actually, it's the same with Iran. The reason for punishing Iran is that in 1979, they threw out the dictator that the United States had installed when it overthrew the parliamentary regime. Not allowed to do that. We now have records on what happened, and they're worth looking at. Some of it was known before, there's more now. What happened is in 1979, Israel and Iran had very close relations under the Shah. It was informal because theoretically they were at war, but the relations were extremely close. They all came out in public after the overthrow of the Shah. Israel had a de facto ambassador in Iran, Yaakov Nimrodi. He declared right away, he said, what's needed in Iran is for the military to have the courage, the strength to put down the uprising by violence. They have to be ready to kill 10,000 people in the streets. And if they're willing to do that, they can crush it. The United States kind of agreed. Wasn't known before, but it's known now that Jimmy Carter, who was the president, sent a NATO general to Iran to try to encourage the military to carry out a military coup and crush the uprising by force. Well, he was unable to do it. The military thought they couldn't get away with it. There was too much popular opposition, so they wouldn't do it. Now, right after that, the U.S. started immediately punishing Iran harshly. Saddam Hussein invaded. The U.S. strongly supported the invasion, military aid. The United States, even when Saddam was using chemical warfare to kill hundreds of thousands of Iranians, don't care. When Saddam started using chemical weapons against his own people, Kurds in the north, Reagan denied that it was happening. It wouldn't permit even censure. Soon, in fact, the United States entered the war directly to win it for Saddam. That's what happened. Then the Bush administration came in. First thing it did was invite Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for training in advanced nuclear weapons production and on. Finally, Saddam made a mistake, invaded Kuwait, didn't understand orders, and things changed. But not with regard to Iran. Punishment continues. Harsh sanctions without any change. And finally, Obama recognized that what's happening by the harsh sanctions is just that Iran is developing its nuclear programs. So he agreed to the joint agreement, JCPOA, United States, European countries, endorsed by the UN Security Council, which issued orders that every state must adhere to the provisions of the joint agreement. Trump came in, immediately violated the orders, withdrew from the agreement, and now is punishing Iran for reacting to his destruction of the agreement. Now, this means extremely harsh sanctions on Iran, which are brutally punishing, especially at the time of the pandemic, means they can't get, medicines and so on, very much like the sanctions on Venezuela. Europe doesn't like them, opposes them, but it has to adhere to them. What did Biden do? Picked up Trump's program exactly, following it without any change. Okay? That's what it means to rule the world. There's a lot of talk about U.S. decline. Not much to it. Yes, the U.S. isn't as powerful as it was at the peak of its power, but it's overwhelming international power. No other country can issue sanctions and expect anyone to pay any attention to them. There are other countries that issue sanctions following the United States. Okay, then Europe will do it too. But nobody can say you're under sanctions and nobody's allowed to trade with you. Everybody would laugh. The United States does it, they don't laugh. That's power.
Okay, and how do you think the military will behave during Biden government? On the January 6th assault, the military took their time to react to the assault. It might be seen as a kind of support to that action. So, okay, how do you think the military will behave? Is there any chance of support of them to the Trump followers during Biden government?
I think what happens is a little different and interesting. Before January 6th, Trump had been trying to purge the military of more or less independent voices and putting in people more loyal to it. He didn't succeed. When he wanted the military to intervene in Washington, they refused. When he went on that trip of his, when he took a walk to read the Bible, to hold up the Bible in front of a church, the military refused to go along. Some did, but most refused. He obviously recognized that he was not going to be able to control the military. When there were uprisings and demonstrations in Portland, Oregon, Trump wanted to send in the military to suppress them. They wouldn't go. He had to call in paramilitary forces, like the Border Patrol. Border Patrol, not far from where I live in Arizona. These are people who are just trained, especially their shock troops, are trained just to kill anybody. They're trained to kill the refugees who are fleeing misery. If they find a way into the desert, just kill them. That's what they're trained for. Just get rid of them. So they're the ones who were sent to Oregon, not the military. And in fact, why the military? The orders to call out the military, they have to come from the president. And they didn't come. They didn't come from the White House. So they delayed till they got their orders. For the Capitol building, the person in charge of the police is Mitch McConnell. He didn't call out. So when the Capitol Police were acting for aid, he just disregarded it. But I don't think the military is supporting Trump. A lot of the troops are. A lot of the troops are pro-Trump, but it seems that the officer corps is quite loyal to the idea of civilian leadership. They made some pretty strong statements, very strong statements. In fact, high military officials who are now retired but highly respected came out with declarations warning the military. In fact, they came out with a statement to the Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the highest military order, saying straight out, remember your constitutional vow to protect the country against enemies, domestic or foreign. That's what they said. Your duty is to protect the country against domestic enemies, meaning the crowds that Trump is, the militias and others that Trump is organizing. They said it very straight, and apparently it was accepted. The top military command came out with statements saying, we're committed to civilian control. We're not going to interfere with elections or anything else. Trump was trying desperately, still is in fact, to try to reverse the elections. I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Bolsonaro was the only foreign leader to claim that the elections were stolen, which is, of course, total garbage. But the top military in the United States wouldn't agree with that. They said, no, we're going to defend the Constitution against the president, the ex-president. And in fact, the country is split. It just seriously split. And it's not very clear which way it's going to go. Trump does have the support of the voters of the Republican Party. Can look into who they are. It's not the working class. They're mostly moderately affluent, petty bourgeois. And take a look at the crowds. You saw plenty of photographs of the crowds on January 6th. They were basically lower middle class, storekeepers, insurance salesmen, very few young people. It's quite striking because in public demonstrations, always mostly young people. Practically no young people in those pictures. It's mildly affluent, rural, less educated, tend from traditional families, very strong Christian evangelical element, Christian nationalists, white supremacists, people who feel that their country is being taken away from them. Their traditional white supremacist Christian country, where the colored people know their place. They don't interfere where they don't belong. You're familiar with that in Brazil. An extreme version of it, in fact. That attitude is the large base of the Trump supporters. And you can understand their position, in fact. You take a look at what neoliberal globalization has done to rural America. It's a disaster. You go through a rural town in the United States, the houses are for sale, the businesses are boarded up, the bank is closed, maybe there's still a couple of churches. The young people are leaving because the industrial work has been closed down. All the policies of starting in Reagan, picked up by Clinton, continuing with Bush and Obama, and extended further by Trump. Now, they don't see it that way. What they see is our lives are being destroyed. Small farmers are all closing up. They can't survive. Big agribusiness taking over. This is all neoliberal globalization, and it's hurt them seriously. They're not starving to death. They're moderately affluent, but your life is being taken away. Your future's being taken away. Your country's being taken away. That's fertile terrain for demagogues. In Europe as well. Somebody who comes up and says, "Follow me, I'm your savior. I'm going to save you against the hated elites." And Trump, whatever you think of him, is a genius at that. He can stand up before a crowd, raising a banner that says, "I love you," while with the other hand, he's stabbing you in the back. That's a pretty good trick. He's done it very successfully. As I said, his legislative proposals are very harmful to working people and the poor, the middle class. But what they see is the country being taken over by minorities, by urban elites who talk about crazy things like global warming and rights of the women's rights and so on. We don't want any of that stuff. We want our nice traditional Christian conservative lives, all white, no bother from anyone else. That's what we want. It's being stolen from us. And our communities are being destroyed, which they are. Okay? That's a very ugly brew, dangerous one. We see something similar in Europe, where it's a large part of the reason why the traditional parties have collapsed in Europe. The parties who ran the country forever, center left, center right, are pretty much gone. Same things. The neoliberal period has been extremely harsh for most of the population. Again, this is not Central Africa, so people aren't starving to death. But what they see is their lives being torn apart. They don't know, maybe not know the reasons, but it's very easy to turn them to blame somebody else. You can blame it on immigrants, blacks. Ronald Reagan was a genius at this. He's a super racist president. His stories about the rich black women who drive-in limousines to the welfare office to steal your money, things like that. He was allowed to get away with it constantly. Extreme racism. But it catches people. Okay, I'll blame them. I'll blame those rich black women. I'll blame immigrants. Anything but the people who are really doing it, the corporate elites and the government that they control. That's who's doing it, but they protect themselves. Somebody else. You know?
Yeah. I hear you talking, and it appears to me the image of Bolsonaro. I mean, that's exactly what he has been doing during the electoral campaign, during his government. And I ask you, what do you think may come out of this in these next 2 years, well, year and a half of Bolsonaro's government? Seeing things like today, where when he changed the 6 ministers, it seems to, at the same time, trying to make not trying to reinforce his political alliance, and at the same time bring the military nearer to him.
And I will add to that. Do you think you have the at risk? We are at risk of a military coup in Brazil?
Sorry, I didn't hear. Say that again.
Do you believe that we here in Brazil we are at risk of a military coup?
Oh, Brazil is different. In the United States, the military is under civilian control. We didn't have military coups. We don't have days in which you celebrate the military coup and the imposition of a neo-Nazi style security state. You do. In fact, it's coming up. One of the bad mistakes of the Lula administration was not to carry out an educational and cultural program. I don't think young people in Brazil know very much about the military regime. Okay, something that maybe their grandparents talk about. But the impression I hate to talk to you like this, you know far better than me. But the impression that I get from reading and personal contacts, such as they are, is that they're really unaware of it. The military is regarded as the savior of the nation. They make decisions, it's the right ones. Here, it is understood, including the military leadership, that they are under civilian control. They don't carry out military coups. I just gave you some examples with Trump, but that's pretty well established. I've given talks in West Point, the main military academy. You talk to the cadets, talk to the colonels and so on. This is their picture of the world. We're not about to carry out a military coup. Contrary to what a lot of rumors say, it's also true of the CIA. CIA does not rarely carries out rogue operations. They do what they're told by the state executive. It's often brutal, murderous, but the CIA provides what's called plausible deniability. The people are actually giving the orders from the White House. They can say, oh, we didn't know about it. We didn't do it. Somebody else did it. But they're following their orders. And the example I just gave about Carter and the Iranian military is a good example. Like it was known for 40 years that Carter had sent a general to Iran, and you could guess what it was for. When I was writing about it over these years, I said, probably to instigate the military, but the official story was different. It was, we just wanted to see what's happening. Let's negotiate. We now have the documents. Okay, that's plausible deniability. You can look like a pacifist peacemaker and so on, but you're really giving the orders. And the intellectual classes support this almost 100%. Take a look at the New York Times this morning. this morning's New York Times. I'm sure you have it on the internet. There's a lead article by one of their top foreign correspondents, Stephen Lee Myers. Right now, he's the bureau chief in Beijing. And it's about how the terrible Chinese are trying to organize reactionary states around the world to combat the United States, which has always been committed to law, the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. It happens that a couple of hours ago, I was talking at a conference of Latin Americans, people from many Latin American countries. You read that sentence, they just collapse into laughter. The United States is supporting the rule of law, democracy, human rights. I mean, tell that to somebody in Latin America, they burst out laughing. Same in Africa, the Middle East. In fact, if you look at international polls run by the main polling organizations, Gallup, one of the questions they asked is, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? Nobody's even close. The United States is way at the top. Way behind in second place is Pakistan, and that's because of the Indian vote. And countries like Iran aren't even mentioned. Well, that's the world. It's not the doctrine. What the doctrine is, the main threats to world peace are Iran, China, Cuba. I mean, it has nothing to do with the world. In fact, world opinion is simply ignored. It's take a rule of law. The United States is the only country that has been condemned by the International Court of Justice for international terrorism. 1986, when Nicaragua brought a case against Washington, and the World Court ruled for Nicaragua, condemned the United States for what they called unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism, ordered the United States to pay substantial reparations. What happened? The New York Times, official voice of American liberalism, had an editorial saying, doesn't mean a thing. The World Court is what they called a hostile forum. It's a hostile forum because it ruled against the United States. And since it's a hostile forum, you don't have to pay any attention to it. Went to the Security Council. Security Council afraid to criticize the U.S., but they did have a resolution calling on all states to adhere to international law. Nobody was mentioned. Everybody knew what it meant. U.S. vetoed it. Okay. You think anybody in the United States knows that? I mean, what I'm just telling you, you couldn't find 1% of the population who ever heard of it. And these are people who've heard talks from me and a couple of others, all suppressed. Official doctrine, this morning's New York Times, top correspondent. The U.S. has always been committed to the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. I mean, you can't even laugh. You know, I don't have to run through the record for you. And when you tell it to somebody, say in Latin America, of course they laugh, but it doesn't penetrate here. That's what's called very effective indoctrination. Very free country, but very intensely indoctrinated. In fact, the two things go together. The freer the country, the more you have to indoctrinate. If you have a tyranny, it doesn't matter that much what people believe. Can't do anything about it anyway. But if in a free country, people know the truth, they can do something about it. Actually, Orwell wrote about this, why indoctrination is more necessary, more effective in freer countries. And you see it in places like the US. But you can break out of it, and people do, and that's why you have popular movements. So that's the hope for the future.
No, let's talk about Lula. In the past weeks, court decisions have returned Lula's political rights. What this return means to Brazil and for the world?
Well, I have my own interpretation of this, partly given to me by my wife, Valeria, who you know very well, who follows the news very closely. And she pointed out something to me that I hadn't noticed about the first court decision. In fact, if you read it carefully, it said nothing about the charges against Lula. It essentially absolved Moro. It said it was just a jurisdictional problem. So no critique of the cheating, criminality, chicanery that Moro was guilty of in forcing through that criticism. Now, the second decision goes a little beyond that, but the first one basically said nothing, said move it to a different jurisdiction. And my guess, again, your guess is much better than mine, so I feel reluctant to say it, but I think there'll be plenty of efforts to prevent Lula from running, serious efforts, because partially just of the intense class hatred in Brazil, which is pretty shocking. Lots of sectors just don't want some guy who doesn't even speak proper Portuguese to be there. He doesn't belong in a position of power. He's a poor working guy, not even. It's kind of like the attitudes toward Chavez and by the wealthy in Venezuela. What's this guy who looks half indigenous doing up there? He doesn't belong there. And of course, they didn't like his policies. It's kind of interesting to see what's happening in financial markets. As soon as Lula was freed, even though he had catered to financial markets too much, I think, but he'd offered them everything he wanted, but not enough. There's never enough. And the idea that the person they loved was Paulo Guedes, privatize everything, give everything away to foreign investors. That's perfect, Who could you love better than that? And what they're afraid is financial markets, or maybe there'll be a move away from what are called financial reforms, economic reforms. That's a term that means give everything away to the rich, including foreign investors who can buy up the country. That's called economic, sound economics. Okay. Guedes, as you know, cut his teeth in Pinochet's Chile, where the far-right economists were running the economy, and don't have to tell you what happened. But, that's financial markets. And the military, I'm sure, doesn't want them back. And they have plenty of power in Brazil. Lula himself had a pretty remarkable record. It's not my opinion. It's the record of the world, but the opinion of the World Bank. 2016, the World Bank, which is not exactly a radical institution, did a close, careful analysis of the Brazilian economy. They called the Lula years the golden decade. Enormous reduction of poverty, inclusiveness, bringing many people, poor people, others, bringing them into the mainstream of the society. It's always hated by the elites. They talked about the collapse in commodity prices. They said there would have been straightforward ways to deal with them. Wasn't a problem. Could have continued with the golden decade. Well, the rich in Brazil and abroad don't want that. They want it ended. They want policies like privatize everything, give the country away to me. That's what they want. Okay. Lula, meanwhile, is standing up, making very important, powerful statements right now. I think if he can manage to escape the forces that'll try to block him, it's a way out for Brazil. That's the hope, I think. In fact, Brazil, just take a look at Brazil in the world scene. During the Lula years, Brazil was the most respected country in the world, literally. Honored everywhere. Was also the voice for the global South, bringing the South together. Take a look at the attitude toward Brazil today. What's this pathetic country? It's something to be pitied and laughed at. The change is enormous, and you can credit that largely to Lula and Bolsonaro. That's the difference. Same thing happened with the United States. Attitudes towards the United States they were never very high, but they collapsed totally under Trump, except for the super rich and the far right, the reactionary international that he was trying to construct.
That's right.
So do you think there are chances of change in Brazil in the horizon, or we are stuck with this far right government for the next 2 years or even more?
How far back is the golden decade? Is it ancient history? Just happened a few years ago. There's a lot more to be unearthed. I'm sure there's plenty that's still hidden. Like take Dilma's proposals to use profits from Petrobras for social justice issues. You think international investors like that? Well, we don't have documents, but I think we can make some guesses about what lay behind the soft coup, and they're not, both in Brazil and internationally. As I say, Lula did pretty much cater to international financial interests, rightly or wrongly, but not enough. It's not, they don't want social justice programs. And take the United States. It's a country, no country in the world has anything remotely like the advantages of the United States. A huge country, homogeneous, enormous resources. Since the indigenous population was pretty much exterminated, you have all these resources, wealth, low population density. It ought to be the top, at the top of the world in any international measure. It's not. Take a look at the Human Development Index of the United Nations. The United States ranks, I think, about 17th. Very poor ranking on social justice measures, even though it's the richest place in the world with incomparable advantages. Why? It's probably the most business-run country in the world. It has two political parties, but they're basically factions of a single party, the business party. Business has enormous power. There's very good studies in the United States by excellent political scientists of things like the relation between electability and campaign funding. Very close. You can predict the outcome of an election very closely just by looking at who's funding and how much. And notice that means big funders. A lot of small funders don't have that effect. When you're elected to Congress in the United States, you're going to face an election in 2 years. First thing you have to do is get on the telephone and talk to the big donors and make sure you're going to do what they want. They're the ones who are going to carry over the next election. Okay. Meanwhile, while you're talking to the big donors, flocks of corporate lobbyists are descending on your office. Your staff may be perfectly nice young people who want a better world, but they can't deal with hordes of corporate lawyers with all their resources and wealth and everything else. So it ends up with the corporate system writing the legislation, which the representative then signs. That brings up another set of studies. There's a lot of interesting studies in the United States on a topic that's pretty easy to study, in fact. What's the relation between people's attitudes and the votes of their own representatives? Not hard. We have a ton of information on attitudes, very extensive polling, very reliable. You can see what the votes are. So let's look at the correlation. Virtually none until you get to the top. The latest, most sophisticated study that came out estimates that about 90% of the population is essentially unrepresented, meaning there's essentially no correlation between what they want and what the representatives vote for. They're listening to different voices. When you get to the very top, they make the decisions. Well, you have a country run like that, can be very free, but it's going to be way down in social justice measures. In fact, the United States is about at the bottom of the OECD. And just take a look at health. Bernie Sanders, who has incidentally broken this pattern, very remarkable. It's been very successful. But take a look at the programs for which he's criticized as being too radical, criticized even by liberal Democrats. No, we can't go that far. What are the programs? Universal health care. Did you ever hear of that? God, how radical that is. What country in the world could possibly have universal health care? Well, all of them, okay? But it's too radical for the United States, okay? Free higher education, second program. How can you have that? Maybe a super rich country like Mexico can have it, but how could we have it? You know, that's U.S. politics. I mean, take a look at the study. I mean, the major medical journal in the world is The Lancet, the British medical journal. They recently did a study on just the costs of the U.S. healthcare system, privatized healthcare system. Their rough estimate is about 70,000 deaths a year and $500 billion in costs. Okay, it's a lot of money, a lot of deaths. Why? Well, if you have a privatized system, that's what happens. You go to the hospital in the United States, first thing you have to do is go through a whole bureaucracy of who's going to pay for it. Will the insurance company pay for it? Is there some small print you didn't see there, which when you read this big contract, which says it doesn't cover this case? The hospitals themselves have, rooms full of people with computers trying to figure out who pays what. You go into a hospital in Canada, there's nothing. You just you see the doctor and they do something. Okay, that's what happens when you have a business-run society. It's in fact, there's some estimates of the cost. Just recently, the Rand Corporation, super respectable quasi-government corporation, does research. They came out with a study of just of the neoliberal years, past 40 years, how much wealth had been transferred from the lower 90% of the population to the super rich during the 40 years. Their estimate is $47 trillion. $47 trillion stolen from, they don't put it this way, stolen from the working class, the middle class, poor, put into the hands of the super rich. And which super rich? Not the top 20%, 10%, the top fraction of 1%, who have doubled their wealth from 10% of the wealth of the country to 20%. That's the top 0.1% of the population since Reagan. And it's a serious underestimate because it doesn't take into account something that economists have studied. One very fine Brazilian economist, Lawrence Dobro, one of the people who studied it. How much has been stolen from the population by tax havens? Tax havens were illegal before Reagan, but in opening the door to the rich, said do whatever you like. So Dobro's estimate is about $20 trillion. Other estimates, even by the IMF, are higher than that. It's kind of secret, so you really don't know. But it's certainly tens of trillions of dollars just robbed from the public during just the neoliberal years, in addition to the 50 trillion estimated by the Rand Corporation, very conservative, respectable corporation. Well, that's what happens when you put policy into the hands who say privatize everything. Your contribution. Lula threatens that. He does.
Okay. How do you see the action of the workers? I mean, do you see any movement of the workers or of the left-wing parties in order to change the direction of the world? Or is there any chance to change the direction of the world?
There are movements all over the place. The Progressive International, which is based on the Sanders movement in the United States, on Yanis Varoufakis's DiEM25 in Europe. Lots of voices from the global south. Just been organized. Had its first international meeting a couple months ago. That's bringing together, I hope, has promised to bring together a lot of global movements to struggle against this destructive process. It's basically class war on an international level. And I'm afraid I have to leave. I have a talk coming up in a few minutes.
Do you see any changes with the pandemic? What can you see about the world after the pandemic? The inequality will continue to grow as usual?
That's a major struggle. What will the post-pandemic world be? The people who created the disaster of the last 40 years and profited enormously from it, they're working very hard, relentlessly right now to plan the post-pandemic world. They want it to be the same as the one that brought the pandemic, but harsher, more surveillance, more control, more domination. So pretty clear, very clear what they want. Question is, will the rest of the world let them do it? It doesn't have to. There are alternative forces, like those gathered in the Progressive International, or activist groups all over the world. In Brazil, for example, the MST working against it, the biggest popular movement in the world. Okay, and there are others elsewhere. So it's a question who wins the class struggle. But I really have to leave. I have to give a talk in 5 minutes.
Okay.
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 Okay. Thank you so much, Noam. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I don't know how to end this. Perhaps you can tell me.
Oh.
Ok. Ok.
Ok.
Então, pessoal, a gente conversou aqui, vocês acompanharam aí com o Noam Chomsky, que é, como vocês sabem, um dos principais, ou o principal intelectual do planeta hoje, o cara que pensa o mundo na sua integralidade, né? A economia, os movimentos políticos, a questão do ambiente, que ele destacou bastante logo no início. Né? Essa entrevista foi feita toda em inglês, a gente não tem, não montou, não conseguiu ter até agora tradução simultânea, outro sistema de legendas, são os recursos que nós temos, mas a gente vai fazer uma reportagem sobre essa entrevista, que vai ser publicada no nosso site, o TUTAMÉIA.jor.br. Então, dá para acompanhar a entrevista e também acompanhar a reportagem. Quem quiser voltar a essa conversa sempre enriquecedora com o Chomsky, pode visitar qualquer um dos nossos canais, TUTAMÉIA TV, no YouTube, no Facebook, no Twitter, enfim, aí nos podcasts também. Eu queria destacar alguns pontos aí da conversa com ele.
Como sempre, bem abrangente, né? Falou de Brasil, de Bolsonaro, de Lula, Estados Unidos, China, né? E o poder imperial dos Estados Unidos, que eu acho que é o ponto que ele sempre destaca e que é importante. E eu acho que foi uma conversa bem, uma janela, um pano panorâmico, assim, né?
E não passar pano para os próprios Estados Unidos, né? Apontou a responsabilidade dos Estados Unidos ao longo de sua história, mas principalmente nas últimas décadas, responsabilidade pelos conflitos no mundo, pelo aumento da inequalidade também, da desigualdade, né? E da violência no planeta, né? Eles ficam como xerife do planeta com regras que só servem para os outros, para eles não servem. E falou bastante do Bolsonaro também. A gente vai destacar todos esses pontos aqui na nossa reportagem. Não é isso? Então, convido vocês aí de novo a visitar sempre o nosso site, tutameia.jor.br, se inscrever aqui no YouTube, clicar na sinetinha, tem na nossa página do Facebook também, você pode se inscrever. E a gente até tem um grupo no Facebook chamado Amigos do Tutaméia. Então, quem tiver afim aí, fique à vontade, seja bem-vindo. A gente quer, antes de terminar, agradecer aqui e convidar todos vocês para participar conosco desse agradecimento a todos os profissionais que atuam na área de saúde em todos os níveis. É um trabalho que dá para chamar de heróico hoje, né? Nas condições, enfrentando a Covid, sendo a linha de frente do combate à Covid no Brasil e, ao mesmo tempo, tendo que enfrentar o boicote que faz o governo Bolsonaro, faz um boicote à saúde, faz um boicote à vida, faz um boicote à democracia. Então, o nosso muito obrigado a todos esses profissionais que atuam em todos os níveis aí da área de saúde. E, dito isso, a gente
dá um tchauzinho.
Dá um tchauzinho aí para todo mundo, né? A gente lembra que a pandemia não está fácil, né? E que a política do governo, como eu coloquei logo no início, eu vou mostrar de novo aqui, a política do governo Bolsonaro tem como consequência isso. Então, todo mundo que puder se vacinar, que estiver na idade, coisa e tal, vá se vacinar, obedeça às orientações dos médicos, das instituições de saúde, e lembre que a vacina não é salvo-conduto para ninguém, todos nós temos que continuar nos protegendo e, assim, proteger os outros, que é o que precisamos fazer, ficarmos todos vivos para continuar lutando pela democracia, pela justiça e pela independência do Brasil. Então, tchau, pessoal, até a próxima.
Pessoal, até a próxima.